Members and guests, gentlemen, members and guests, may I have your attention, please? Thank you. Members and guests, I hope you're enjoying your lunch, but right now we have that part of the afternoon where we have our guest speaker. Would you please join me in welcoming Lorraine Meldrum, the CEO of Swan Global, to introduce our guest speaker. Lorraine, please join us.
In February 2016, Iván Arriagada was appointed CEO of one of the world's largest listed copper companies. He's delivering a more conservative balance sheet, particularly in light of lower copper prices. And he's delivering a higher share price when copper has been down. These are just three of the many points to associate with Iván Arriagada. Yes, his company Antofagasta Inc. is based in Chile, which is a region known as one of the richest sources of copper in the world. Not only is Antofagasta one of the world's largest listed copper companies, it has been listed on the London Exchange for just over 125 years. Iván says it's a good time to be a copper miner. He explains that copper is going to be in long-term demand. It's the most efficient metal known in terms of heat and energy transmission. The greener the economy gets, the more we will all use consumer electronics, not forgetting the arrival of electric cars, and thus the more copper is needed. But Iván says there is more. Copper is no doubt one of the most supply-constrained commodities. Think about all that and you realise you are here today listening to a man who is in the box seat. He's in a market that has a bright future. He has some good information to impart. It's a special session today. Ladies and gentlemen, please join with me in welcoming Iván Arriagada.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here today. I was very pleased when I came in the town hall earlier that I could see a very big copper-made doors. So I was very impressed and I feel somewhat at home because of the copper content of the building. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land where we gather here today and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. Very special thanks to the Melbourne Mining Club, to Sir R.V. Parble, patron of the club, and to all distinguished members and guests, and for giving me the opportunity to present to you here today. Chile and Australia have many points of connection, many which date back many years. Being referred to as a New World wine producer is one of them, although I think we have both surpassed the quality and taste of wine from many in the old world. But we're here to talk about mining, another key point of connection for both. It is part of our history, our economic future, and is interwoven into the social fabric of our communities and societies. Before I begin, I must also admit that I have a special personal association with Australia and Melbourne. Many years ago, and after working for almost 20 years in the oil and gas industry, I moved into mining for the first time when joining an Australian company, which is headquartered in your city. Very much an iconic company in Australia, BHP is a company where I had the opportunity to work alongside several Aussie colleagues and was introduced to the mining industry in big scale. This was some 15 years ago, but many of the colleagues I still keep in touch with in one way or another. So, to begin, let me introduce the topic of today. I plan to talk about the challenges facing the copper industry and linking them to Antofagasta's company's involvement. To begin, let me say a few things about our company, and Lorraine was kind enough to introduce Antofagasta. As she said, we're one of the largest copper producers. Our production is approximately 13% of Chile's total copper production. We also produce gold and moly as byproducts. We're listed in the UK Stock Exchange, part of the FTSE 100. We have currently all our operations based in Chile. Los Pelambres and Centinela, which are two of them, are among the largest mining districts in the world, given the size of their respective mineral inventory. And we have two recent additions to our portfolio, which are shown there in the slide. Zaldívar, which we purchased 50% of ownership in late 2015 and own jointly with Barrick, and where we're also operators. And Antucoya, which we inaugurated last week in Chile. We think Antucoya is representative of what mining in Chile will look in the future, given the relative lower grade of the deposit. Therefore, this operation has been designed to operate at higher levels of productive efficiency. I think what is also interesting to note is that the group really developed into a major global player in the last 20 years. In year 2000, Antofagasta was producing around 50,000 tons of copper. That is 10% less, or around 10% of the production that we have today. And with the startup of Los Pelambres that year, it really moved into the bigger leagues. The development of a world-class deposit like Pelambres, the emergence of China as a key driver of copper demand growth, and socio-political conditions in Chile following the return of the country to democratic rule represented unprecedented conditions for mining, development, and investment. And these served as a perfect backdrop which transformed Antofagasta into the company it is today. So in just 20 years, Antofagasta has basically transformed into one of the 10 global copper producers. And as I say, I think it's a combination of very unprecedented conditions, which I guess positions us very well for the future. This is where we are in the table, in the league table of production, as I say, amongst the 10 biggest producers. So what I want to do now is talk about the copper market, and then I will talk about the challenges that we face in the copper industry and how we're addressing some of them. So on the market, first I want to point out that copper demand growth, as is the case with several other commodities, has been over the past several years driven by emerging markets, and particularly China. China has been or copper is largely a China story. China has been crucial to the development of the copper market in the last 10 years. And this is shown very clearly in this graph, where we have the copper demand split by geographical region. China's copper demand has continued growing uninterrupted during the transition to China's new normal, a state of lower but more sustainable economic growth, and targeting a more balanced mix between investment and consumption-led growth. Now, what is the driver? The key driver of this is urbanization. Not population growth, which in China now is almost close to zero, but migration to urban centers from rural areas and achieving higher living standards from improved income levels. At a current 56% rate of urbanization, China is still aiming to move approximately 200 million people by 2030 to city centers, which represents 15 million people per year, which is roughly the population of Chile. Other emerging economies, especially in Asia, are likely to follow similar trends. India can potentially follow, but has remained a source of debate when and how fast, or if ever, it will reach demand levels comparable to China. Political decision-making is different, and GDP composition is different as well. However, it could surprise to the upside, with copper demand currently growing at a rate close to 8% per annum. Growth recovery, more lately, in the EU and US has also provided support for copper demand. Now let's look at copper demand by sector or end use. Construction, which includes property and expansion of the electrical grid, we have talked about since this is a requisite for urbanization. We need also to consider here the demand for industrial and commercial space, which is likely to grow as consumption and consumer demands becomes more important. In keeping with these aspects, I would like to draw your attention on two other issues. First, higher demand of copper coming from consumer goods, that is from electronics to household durables, air conditioners, and heating appliances. A strong feature of copper is that the intensity of copper use is higher when compared with other metals in consumption-led growth, which is what the new normal in China is expected to achieve. Second, copper demand from transport. I think here we are in the initial stages of a major disruption in the technological sense, associated to both clean transport and clean energy. As cost parity of electrical vehicles seems to be approaching very quickly, public policy and private adoption of mass electrical transport is likely to happen sooner and faster than most anticipated. The same is true of clean energy, as energy storage and distributed energy supply networks are making significant inroads into everyday life. These changes will drive copper demand in ways we have yet to fully understand, since copper is the premier metal for electricity and heat conductivity. In addition, the more energy efficient or green a design is, generally the higher copper intensity involved. And a number that is probably familiar to most of you, a conventional car will use around 20 kilos of copper, an electrical car will use around 80 kilos of copper. And what's interesting with electric vehicles is not only the content of copper in each car, but is the need also to build on the grid to be able to charge electrical vehicles, which will require added copper. So I think we're just in the beginning of understanding what this might mean, but it's certainly a very disruptive change, which will mean more copper requirements. So in summary, all of this is positive for copper demand going forward. The underlying fundamental in the mid-long term are very favorable, and on the back of this, we expect demand growth to be between 1% and 2% per annum. This is our conservative expectation of growth, but from a very large base of consumption, which, as we discussed, has expanded significantly in the last several years. Now, let me talk about supply so that we can get a full picture of the copper market, combining both demand and supply. On the supply side, the copper is probably the most supply constrained amongst the cyclical commodities. A key feature of copper supply is that there's a limited amount of supply that year on year, the average mine grade is declining, therefore reducing production. This is very important. And it's not so prevalent in other metals, but in the case of copper, every year the grade at which we mine comes down, which is equivalent to taking out an operation from the existing ones, even all keep producing. Then many of the brownfield expansions, especially from older giant deposits, face technical challenges which extend the lead times to construction, in many cases involving moving from open pit to underground, from oxides to sulfides, or massively increasing the scale of exploitation. Another feature of supply is that realistically the pipeline of new projects that we're seeing today is actually quite small, quite thin. Some have talked in the past of a potential wall of supply hitting the market. We simply did not see this and do not expect that to happen. On the other hand, the industry is much more cautious and likely to be more disciplined in the use of capital, particularly in the next few years, as we're just about emerging out of the recent downturn in commodity prices. So it is more likely than not that the supply response will lag demand requirements for the reasons mentioned above. In summary then, when combining demand and supply factors, we believe the outlook for copper mid to long term is positive. Now in the short term, we think the market is gradually moving to a tighter demand-supply position, which increases the likelihood of a small market deficit this year. Sooner rather than later as well, that will manifest itself as we absorb the impacts from strikes, ban of exports in Indonesia, and other disruption factors we have seen this year. However, we expect to continue to see short-term volatility in price. Some of the risk factors to this very positive outlook include, and I want to mention them to be balanced in my assessment, a hard landing of macro conditions in China, for example, around domestic debt restructuring or property overstocking in Tier 2 or 3 cities, which could impact short-term growth, geopolitical risks, which we know are probably more important today, and protectionism, which could impact trade flows and global economic activity. But absent these factors, I think the balance is positive and the outlook is favorable. Now I want to talk about Chile as we move forward. I'm sure many of you know Chile, but for those of you who do not, let me give you a brief introduction. Chile, like Australia, has a long tradition in mining. It is the largest copper producer in the world and produces about 30% of the world's copper and holds almost the same percentage of global copper resources. Chile is member of the OECD group of countries and has been a mining-friendly and has a stable political environment for decades. Mining accounts for approximately 10% of GDP and generates about half of the country's foreign exchange earnings. So it's very much a mining country, as Australia is. Now, what are the challenges that we're facing today in Chile? One, we need to avoid middle-income stagnation and transition to a high-income economy. Chile came out from being an underdeveloped country, and it's now in the middle of the table, moving into, hopefully, a higher income economy. But we still have to make that step. We must address income inequality, but at the same time reposition economic growth and investment as a key enabler for social development, remaining attractive for long-term mining investments. And lastly, I think a big challenge for Chile as well is to improve labor productivity through reforming education. These challenges are associated with higher levels of economic advancement that Chile has achieved over the last 30 years. And they're probably not too different to those we're seeing elsewhere in similar circumstances, and which Chile is working to address through its existing institutional arrangements. But I think the more important one is that Chile should remain having the conditions to be attractive for mining investment. Now, what are the challenges that we in mining have? And I will talk from the point of view of copper mining in Chile, but many will resonate with you as they are globally relevant. We have several listed in this slide, but I will focus on a few. I'd like to put safety first. As an industry in Chile, we have made tremendous progress towards eliminating fatal accidents and have to continue working on this. I think this is one of the most important success stories that we have in Chile, the improvements that the industry has made on safety. And I think this is very much at the heart of our responsibility to society and the way we must manage our operations. I mentioned before labor productivity, which is here as another challenge. And I think what has happened is that generally wages have grown faster than productivity. Some of the issues impacting productivity relate to local regulations, but others have to do with internal organization of work. And I think here we have an opportunity to adopt new technology that can accelerate productivity improvements and reduce manpower levels. Another challenge to mention is water availability. And this is not only true in Chile, but in many parts of the world. And as climate change is coming, this is making this even more relevant. In Chile, it is unlikely, I would say, that new production from a large mining operation will be sourced from continental water. So progressively, the industry is moving to use desalinated seawater. And this brings me to our next challenge, power. And on power, I think Chile has responded to this challenge well, with the rapid development of power projects, particularly solar projects in the north of the country, which is leading to an increase in power generation capacity. With a dramatic falling cost of building solar and wind capacity and the imminent connection of our northern and southern power grids, power costs are falling significantly due to the abundance of supply. And I think this is very important because it does go to the heart of also making mining more competitive. So how are we responding to the challenges? I think I like to summarize the way that we as an industry in Chile, and we in Antofagasta in particular, respond to these challenges is to focus on three key pillars which I think are going to be very important for industry going forward. One is productivity improvement, the other one is the efficient allocation of capital, and the third one is looking at innovation as a competitive advantage, which I think the industry has been slow generally in the past at taking up as a source of competitive advantage. In productivity, I think the key thing here is that we need to think of it differently. It must no longer be a response to the cyclical downturn in prices. And we want to think of productivity and have to think, I believe, very much as we do with safety. It must be part of our company genetics. We have made fundamental changes, I guess, over time on how we focus on value over volume in decision making, and how at every level of the organization productivity improvement is pushed and pulled. But I think the key thing here is to think of productivity as an embedded element in the culture, very much like safety, not something that we do only in response to the cyclical nature of the price. The second is efficient capital allocation. And I think here the industry must move to make maximum use of shared investment opportunities. Internally in Antofagasta, we're now planning and designing a growth with a district view, especially regarding support infrastructure like water, power, and the supply of other consumables. Another element in capital allocation is sequencing and phasing project development, which provides another opportunity for de-risking growth and ensuring a more efficient capital allocation. The other element, as I mentioned, productivity, efficient capital allocation, is innovation. And this, we think of innovation as a key source that enables accelerating productivity improvements and also reducing the intensity of capital investment. There are several sources of innovation, but I think one of them is what are the strategic choices that we make in innovation. And those strategic choices in the case of Antofagasta are around primary ore leaching, which we think will lead to lower capital intensity of investments, tailing management, which we think will lead to improved productivity out of reducing water consumption, and mass material movement, which will allow us basically to share infrastructure by means of moving mineral to our existing facilities. In addition, I would say in innovation, we have developed a roadmap of new technology adoption, which gives us a clear direction to ensure the business case for new technology is robust, and an integrated approach is taken, which considers the combined impacts of separate solutions. And our focus on our roadmap of new technology is ensuring first and foremost we have a common telecommunications and digital infrastructure at the base on which the various tools can run and be integrated. Second, maximizing the use of real-time and distributed data for decision-making, and introducing technology that reduces manpower requirements at site. It is the case in Chile still that many of the mining operations have camps where the workers stay for 7 days in rosters, and we think that in many instances moving our workers to normal shifts and having them sleep at home would be beneficial. And in some instances the distance is not that long, so we think automation can move us in this direction. So let me talk briefly then a little bit more about these three key ways of responding to the challenges. I've mentioned productivity, efficiency in capital allocation, and innovation. In the case of productivity, we've been very much working on embedding this in an organization, and we've been working on a program which we've called Cost and Competitiveness Program, which has allowed us basically to move our cost down the industry curve, as shown here. So we're today running at 20% lower cost than we were 2 years ago, even though the grade at we mine is down 12%. And these are some of the activities that encompass that program. In terms of efficient capital allocation, I think the key element here is that we are planning the way that we organize our mining operations in districts. And this allows us to basically share infrastructure. A very good example we have today, we inaugurated Antucoya, I mentioned last week, and the water that is supplied to Antucoya uses the same infrastructure of the water system that another of our operations has, which has avoided us to duplicate that investment. I believe that's where the industry will be moving, and we want to be leading in that effort. I think there's also an opportunity in this space to do public and private partnerships. We are building a diesel plant, or plan to build one near Los Pelambres, and we've been discussing with the government whether we can use that infrastructure also to support water for the community by means of a private-public partnership. So I think that's another means of ensuring that we have lower levels of investment by means of sharing the infrastructure that we use. And in innovation, I probably want to mention a couple of things. I think Antofagasta has been leading innovation in many ways, but there are two very important examples that I would like to mention, which are shown in this slide. One is what we call the paste tailings, which essentially means that we're able to process tailings from mining, recovering more water. Our paste tailings today are operating as designed at large scale. It's pioneer for copper to operate at this scale, and we have a solid content of around 70%, which translates essentially in our ability to recycle more water out of the industrial process. I think this is something that we will see more in the industry. The other one is the use of seawater. We use seawater and started using it a very long time ago in our Mechilla operation. So we've been using seawater for a long time, and I think the key distinctive factor for us is that we don't desal the water, we use it with salt because we think that we can achieve increased recoveries by doing so. So innovation in this respect is very much at the heart of Antofagasta. Renewables, around 50% of the energy that's supplied to Antofagasta comes from renewable energy in the form of solar and wind. And we also like to include here community, because I think we've had to rethink in innovative ways the way to relate and engage with communities, especially in one of our sites. And we're very proud of the community engagement program that we have installed, which is called Somos Choapa, and which is shown here in this slide. The program is predicated on the principles of genuine participation and transparency. We have engaged the local community in open dialogue, which are recorded and made public in YouTube, and with the presence of NGOs like Chile Transparente, which is a Chilean branch of Transparency International. This process has involved a lot of listening and sharing to develop a shared view of the future for the area. We are common neighbors, and we must develop a multi-year portfolio of projects and initiatives to work together. And I think this is very important because this represents one of the major challenges that the industry has going forward, which is the social license to operate and essentially how we relate with communities. And I want to mention an example of an energy company which I knew was doing a project in Chile. And as they were doing this project, they developed with consultants the approach to communities and came up with some projects that they needed to undertake for supplying water, housing, which they seemed and considered to be of high priority. But to their surprise, as they were displaying this to the community manifested their disagreement and actually was unsettled with these propositions. They sat down with the community, and I know this case very closely, and they came to the conclusion after listening to them that what bothered this community, the concerns they have, that the pain they had was mostly around taking their kids to Santiago, capital city, and having them study technical roles or in the university and in being able to sustain themselves in a larger city. And they were failing to do so because they didn't have the means to accomplish that. So they changed their approach and ended up being quite responsive to the needs of the community. And I think this is a very good example of how mining used to be in the past, much more of a transactional approach, maybe arrogant in the way of approaching the dialogue with the community instead of listening. So at the heart of this new way of engaging in our model is listening and being humble in understanding the requirements of the community. So to summarize, we have in Antofagasta a framework for value creation, which we think is relevant for managing a business in the bad times as well as the good times. We're very much focused on disciplined production. At Antofagasta, our priority after safety is not to grow volume for the sake of growth, but to produce tons that contribute cash and earnings, and if they do not to mind them. We're managing or focus on managing our costs and improving the operating reliability of our equipment, capturing all available spare capacity. Then we believe sustainability is a source of economic long-term value creation. And in this respect, we have made very important progress in our relationship with the communities near our operations. We have taken a strategic view on innovation choices that we are pursuing, as I described them before. And by doing all this, we are positioning the business to be ready for growth. However, I must emphasize that we will at all times maintain our capital discipline. We will be return-focused on the deployment of capital for growth, and this will dictate when and how we grow, whether organically or by other means. So that ends my presentation. I wanted to give you an overview of the copper market. As I say, our outlook is quite favorable, and I think you know, especially the very disruptive changes that are being brought about by clean energy and clean transport means that copper will be required, I would say, more than many had anticipated a few years ago. Chile is a mining country. I've also wanted to emphasize that, and has been, and faces challenges as much as everywhere else. But I think it's very much in the interest of Chile to keep attractive for mining and for copper in the long term, as it relies heavily on income and exports from copper. And we at Antofagasta are in the middle of copper and Chile. That's where our home is. We are a global company today, but we think we are very well positioned for what may come in the future. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I would like now to take the time for any questions. Thank you.
Okay, we've got time for 3 or 4 questions. Richard Shoddy's over here and Sam Street's over here. Sam, we've got one down here. When you do have a question, could you please stand, identify yourself? Iván, one here.
Peter Harris from AP Capital. Thank you for your presentation. Can you just run us through your approach to driving productivity through your relationships with your employees and labour relations, and how your approach differs to some of the other Australian miners that we've seen have issues in Chile, in particular Escondida? Thank you.
Well, I think a couple of things have happened in Chile in the sort of labour relations space. One is that, I mean, all companies, most companies, we have been pushing for productivity improvements, as you indicate. And I think some of that has meant that we have to undo some of the agreements or benefits or compensation schemes that existed before, and which are legacy of the time in which the copper price was at around $4 per pound. And I think how we go about undoing them is very critical to the success that we may have. Our approach is that we like to think that we are able to do that by open dialogue with our workforce and working those changes with them. There are points of tension, but we've managed to be able to do that in a constructive way. In some cases, if you want to take out some of the benefits, there is a price to pay up front, and that's something that we've recognized that has to occur. And the negotiations and the payments that take place at that time, we think are a good opportunity to do that. Thinking that you can undo some of these benefits without buying them out in some way by means of making some form of payment which is included in the labor contract, I think is a bit unrealistic, and I think that's what the situation has shown in Chile. The other aspect, I would say, in the labor relations space is that we have a new law, and the law was implemented in April. And when you have a new law, there is more uncertainty and risk. and you have to run the provisions of the law through a couple of negotiations before you become fully comfortable. So that has introduced a little bit more risk, but we have accomplished 2 labor negotiations which we have closed, and we did those under the new law provisions. So we were able to learn through them and managed to close them successfully. As a last just point on this, I would say that labor relations in Chile are very much company specific. Each company has its own story of labor relations, and therefore we should not either extrapolate, that one experience can be taken to another company. There are no negotiations that take place across the industry, so it's very much company specific. But our approach has been that we can work with the workers around these changes, and that has resulted and paid us well. I don't claim, and in this we have to be very careful not to be arrogant either, that we are better at labor relations, but we certainly are different and have done it successfully in this past 2 negotiations.
Richard Morrow from Baillieu Holst. Iván, thank you very much for your presentation. Is there a lower limit that your copper grades can go, or the world's copper grades can go, where you think it is? And can you put a bit more colour around what you're doing in that new operation you mentioned as being the future of copper mining in Chile?
Yeah. So the lowest I've seen in terms of operation is probably around 0.2 or 0.25 today. But obviously it's all relative. I mean, if you think into the future, you can think of spaces where even lower grades may be mineable. It's all a matter of what the long-term price that you're working with is. There are very efficient operations in the US, for example, which has been a mining district for many years, which operate at very low grades and do that efficiently. So I would say, venture to say that probably today around 0.25, 0.2 is about the limit that you would go today, but that will evolve and change over time. In the case of Antucoya, I think one of the features is Antucoya is 0.35, the mine we inaugurated last week, and one of the things, the way we've designed the organization is to be lean, and that means that we have a different span of control, different number of layers, and in essence, less people working in the facility. We also used the shared infrastructure, as I mentioned before. All the water system, we're basically using the one that Centinela has. So even though it is water from the sea, we did not have to invest because we're using the infrastructure that we already had, and I think that's also a feature of the future. And also we've recycled some of the mining equipment from our other operations. So instead of buying full-blown mining equipment, we're actually recycling some of that from Pelambres and Centinela. So those are some of the features that we have at Antucoya, which I think make it quite productive. And I think into the future, this is the type of mining that we need to continue to learn to do, because that's the type of deposits that we will face.
Way up the back. Lady.
Hi, Rachel Hammett, Canaccord. You stated previously that 50% of your project power comes from solar and wind. How do you plan to upscale that to 100% if possible?
Yeah. Well, I think we are probably quite advanced in being at 50%, and this is especially at Los Pelambres. The issue is that it's difficult to think that you can get to 100%, and the reason being is that you need some base load energy provision to be able to deal with the intermittent nature of renewables, especially solar energy. So we don't think, that we will move ever to 100% unless and until, there is a technological change that allows basically electricity to be stored, which is not what the state of the art is today. But certainly we seem to be moving in that direction quite quickly. So we will continue to look at ways of increasing, but I think we are quite in a leading position where we are today. Our strategy on energy, we're a mining company, is that we want to secure supply at competitive cost. Renewable energy is proving to be cheaper than fossil fuel energy in Chile, and we will therefore pursue it quite actively for that reason. But we don't have a set target of moving to 100%.
We have time for 2 more questions. Richard's got one here, Sam's got one there, then we must move on. Please, Richard.
Hello, I'm a student at Monash University. Can you tell us a little about how the company transitioned from being in a transport to being in mining? And is this something that you suggest other transports or infrastructure companies should do?
No, look, I think we have not, I think the company was always a mining company, and that was, I would say, the spirit of the company, founders all throughout. What happened is that the mining business grew initially more slowly than the transport business. But I would say that at the very heart of the founders' spirit has been mining all the way through. And this is not a story of transitioning from transport to mining. I think it's really been a story of transitioning from very small mining to large-scale global capacities like we have today. We have a transport division still, which moves acid and cathodes in the north of Chile. We're very proud of it because it's very much linked to the history of Antofagasta, and we like it very much in the portfolio as it sits today. But I would say our story is more one of transitioning from being a local, mid-size or small producer coming from the north of Chile, from Antofagasta, which is a very small city and region and used to be smaller 20 years ago, to becoming in 20 years the corporation that we are today. And that was out of the skills of the founder, an entrepreneur called Andrónico Luksic, the development of Los Pelambres, which is a world-class deposit, the emergence of China and the supercycle, and also socio-political conditions in Chile, which allowed investment to flourish after Chile came back into democratic rule. So a very unique set of circumstances, which allows this company to develop in a very short time into what it is today.
Okay. One last question, Adrian.
Yeah, Adrian Prendergast from Morgans Financial. Thanks for your presentation and comments, Ivan. It's been very interesting. I know the politics in Chile can be as interesting and colourful as what we enjoy here in Australia. And I just wanted to get your comments, given we are in an election year, which kicks off in Chile in November, and what it would mean for Antofagasta and the mining industry if there was a change of government.
Yeah, I think I see that one of the key challenges for Chile is to reposition growth and investment as key for the progress of the country. I think what happened a few years ago is that it seemed to have been taken for granted that investment and growth was going to happen regardless of what was happening elsewhere in the world. And several reforms were introduced during this government, and some of them have not been implemented well and therefore have meant some setbacks for the business environment that existed before. Taxes, were changed. I think there's no argument that taxes needed to be increased to be able to fund education, but the reform itself wasn't probably implemented well. And then there's been a change to the labor law and other legal changes. I think the discussion in terms of contingent local politics then in Chile heading to this election is around whether, the growth, economic growth, investment, development will be repositioned to allow the country to continue developing. Chile used to grow at 5% per annum. For these last 3 years, it's been growing at an average rate of around 1.5% and 2%. And there's still people that need to move out of poverty. There's still, a lot of social work that needs to be done. So it's striking probably the right balance between being able to work on improving income equality, distributing wealth, but also on creating conditions to remain a key attractive place to invest. So I think the discussion in the coming election is going to be centered very much around that. You know, we are a long-term investor. We've got 4 operations in Chile, operate globally, and therefore, obviously, I mean, we work with all governments. But that's where the, socially, if you want, where the conversation and discussion is going in Chile.
Okay. Thanks, Iván. I'd like to call on Patrick Smith, the Managing Director of AMC Consultants, to propose a vote of thanks. Patrick, would you please join us?
Thank you, Iván. A takeaway for me from your presentation is the coming transformation in copper supply and demand. With the impact of multiple factors to be considered together, not in isolation, such as ongoing urbanization, electric vehicles, and declining grades. Exciting times ahead for copper and the global economy. And as you say, it is a good time to be in copper. Members and guests, please join me in thanking Iván.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'm told this is a very interesting present to be used with my colleagues.
Yes, Iván thought it would be very useful on his desk back in head office from time to time. Members and guests and sponsors, it's now time to donate some of your money. Twice each year, the Melbourne Mining Club on your behalf donates funds to the education programs supported by the Minerals Council of Australia and the AusIMM. Representing our patron Sir Avi Parbo, please welcome to the stage the Chairman of the Mining Club, Richard Morrow.